On a cold November night in 2019, David Miller stood at his kitchen sink washing dishes when he heard 3 soft knocks at his front door. It was 11:47 at night. He lived alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where people still left their porch lights on and knew their neighbors by name. David hadn't been expecting anyone. His closest friend lived 2 states away, and his family had stopped visiting after the funeral. He dried his hands on a kitchen towel and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. When he opened it, he found a woman standing on his porch, drenched from head to toe, her hair plastered against her face, her body shaking violently. She was pregnant, visibly so, maybe 7 or 8 months along. Her eyes were wide and desperate, and when she saw him, she let out a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Then she said something that made David's blood turn to ice. She said his name. Not the way a stranger would say it, not with hesitation or formality. She said it the way his wife used to say it, with familiarity and warmth and a hint of relief, as if she'd been searching for him for a very long time. David stared at her, frozen, his hand still gripping the doorknob. The woman stepped forward, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the wooden porch. She reached out and touched his face with trembling fingers, and her voice cracked when she spoke again. She told him she'd been trying to get home. She told him she'd been lost, confused, held somewhere she couldn't remember. And then she said the words that would launch a federal investigation and unravel one of the most disturbing mysteries in modern American history. She looked him in the eyes, tears streaming down her face, and she whispered, "David, it's me. I'm Emily. I'm your wife." David Miller's wife had been dead for 2 years. She had vanished on a rainy night in April of 2017, her car found abandoned on the side of a rural highway, the driver's side door wide open, her purse still on the passenger seat. Search teams combed the area for weeks. Divers searched nearby rivers. Volunteers walked through fields and forests calling her name. But Emily Miller was never found. After 6 months, she was legally declared dead. David had buried an empty casket. Now, standing in front of him, soaked and shaking and very much alive, was a woman who claimed to be her. A woman who knew his name. A woman who was carrying a child. David didn't scream. He didn't slam the door. He stood there, staring at her, his mind trying to process what his eyes were seeing. And then, against every logical instinct he had, he let her inside. What happened next would bring the FBI to his doorstep, uncover a secret operation buried deep within the American medical research community, and force the nation to confront a question it wasn't ready to answer. How far is too far when science tries to play God? This is the story of a woman who came back from the dead. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Because the truth, the real truth, was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. And it all started with that knock at midnight. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. David Miller wrapped a blanket around the woman's shoulders and sat her down on his couch. She was shivering uncontrollably, her lips tinged blue, her clothes soaked through. He made her tea, handed her the mug, and watched as she wrapped her hands around it like it was the only warmth left in the world. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to think. So he just sat across from her and waited. The woman looked around the living room with an expression that was hard to describe, a mixture of recognition and confusion, like she was seeing something familiar through a fog. Her eyes landed on a framed photograph on the mantel, a picture of David and Emily on their wedding day, both of them young and smiling, the sun setting behind them. The woman's face crumpled and she started to cry. Not the loud, desperate sobs from before, but quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks and dripped onto the blanket. She looked at David and said, "I remember that day. You told me I looked like an angel. You cried during your vows." David's heart stopped. Those were things only Emily would know. He asked her questions, simple ones at first, testing her. What was the name of their dog when they first got married? She answered correctly. Baxter. What song did they dance to at their wedding? She knew. Unchained Melody. What was the nickname he called her when they were alone? She smiled through her tears and said, Lucky. No one else knew that. Not his family, not his friends. It was something private, something sacred between the two of them. David felt his hands begin to shake. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe her more than anything in the world. But the woman sitting in front of him didn't look exactly like Emily. Her face was similar, yes, the same bone structure, the same eyes. But her hair was darker. Her voice was slightly different. And Emily had never been pregnant. They'd tried for years, gone through treatments, faced disappointment after disappointment. Emily couldn't have children. That's what the doctors had told them. So who was this woman, and whose baby was she carrying? David didn't sleep that night. He sat in his bedroom with the door locked, his phone in his hand, trying to decide what to do. The woman, the one who claimed to be Emily, had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted and still wrapped in the blanket. David stared at his phone screen, his thumb hovering over the emergency call button. He thought about his wife, the real Emily, the woman he'd loved since they were 16 years old. He thought about the night she disappeared, the way he'd waited by the phone for days, hoping for a ransom call, a sighting, anything. He thought about the funeral, standing in front of that empty casket, feeling like his entire world had collapsed. And now, 2 years later, someone was sitting in his living room claiming to be her. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But those details, those private, intimate details she knew, how could she know them? David made his decision. At 6 a.m, he called the police. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. David explained the situation as calmly as he could, though his voice shook the entire time. The woman woke up when she heard the officers' voices, and when she saw them, she started to panic. She backed into the corner of the living room, her hands instinctively moving to protect her stomach, and she looked at David with an expression of pure betrayal. She kept saying, "Why are you doing this? David, it's me. It's me." The officers were professional but cautious. They asked her for identification. She had none. They asked her name. She said Emily Miller. They asked where she'd been for the past 2 years. She said she didn't know, that her memory was fragmented, that she remembered being in a cold place with white walls and people in masks. One of the officers stepped outside to make a call. The other stayed with David and the woman, his hand resting on his belt, his eyes never leaving her. Within an hour, the house was surrounded, not by local police, but by federal agents. The FBI had arrived. Special Agent Caroline Hayes was the lead investigator assigned to the case. She was a woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and methodical, the kind of person who didn't believe in coincidences. She sat across from the pregnant woman in David Miller's dining room and asked her a series of questions, her voice calm but firm. The woman answered each one, her hands folded protectively over her belly, her eyes red from crying. Agent Hayes took notes, her expression unreadable. Then she asked the woman if she would consent to a DNA test. The woman agreed immediately. She said she had nothing to hide. Agent Hayes also requested David's DNA, along with any personal items that had belonged to Emily Miller. David handed over Emily's hairbrush, still tucked away in a drawer in their bedroom, untouched since the day she disappeared. The samples were sent to the FBI lab for expedited analysis. Agent Hayes told them the results would take 48 hours. In the meantime, the woman would be taken to a secure medical facility for observation and examination. David protested. He wanted her to stay. He didn't fully understand why, but something inside him couldn't let her go. Agent Hayes looked at him with something close to sympathy and said, "Mr. Miller, until we know who this woman is, she's not safe here, and neither are you." The woman was escorted out of the house by 2 agents. She looked back at David as they led her to the car and she mouthed the words, "I love you." David stood in his doorway and watched the car drive away, his chest tight, his mind racing. Agent Hayes stayed behind. She walked through the house slowly, her eyes scanning every detail. She stopped in front of the mantel, looking at the wedding photo, then turned to David and asked, "Did your wife have any siblings, any family members who might look like her?" David shook his head. Emily was an only child. Her parents had passed away years before she disappeared. Agent Hayes nodded, jotting something down in her notebook. Then she asked another question, one that made David's stomach turn. "Mr. Miller, where did your wife work before she disappeared?" David hesitated. Emily had worked at a private medical research facility on the outskirts of Columbus, a place called Genesis Biomed. She'd been a lab technician there for almost 10 years. David had visited the facility once shortly after Emily vanished, but the staff had been unhelpful, almost evasive. They'd told him Emily had left work that day at her usual time and that they had no information beyond that. Agent Hayes wrote down the name of the facility, underlined it twice, and looked up at David. "We'll be in touch," she said. Then she left. 48 hours later, the DNA results came back. Agent Hayes called David and asked him to come to the FBI field office downtown. He drove there in a daze, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he arrived, he was taken to a small, windowless room where Agent Hayes was waiting with another agent, a man named Robert Kwan. They both looked serious. Agent Hayes gestured for David to sit down, and then she slid a folder across the table toward him. Inside were the lab reports. David scanned the pages, trying to make sense of the technical jargon, the columns of numbers and genetic markers. Agent Hayes explained it in plain terms. The fingerprints taken from the woman matched Emily Miller's prints on file. Perfectly. No discrepancies. But the DNA told a different story. The woman's DNA showed a partial genetic match to Emily Miller, approximately 52% overlap, far too high to be coincidence but not high enough to be the same person. Even stranger, the woman's blood type didn't match Emily's at all. Emily had been O positive. The woman was AB negative. Agent Hayes leaned forward, her hands folded on the table, and said, "Mr. Miller, we don't know who this woman is. But we do know one thing. She's not your wife." David felt the room tilt. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. He asked the only question that made sense to him. Then how does she know everything about Emily? How does she know things no one else could possibly know? Agent Hayes exchanged a glance with Agent Kwan. Then she said, "That's what we're trying to figure out, but there's something else you need to know." She opened another file, this one thicker, filled with photographs and incident reports. She turned it toward David. The images showed the interior of Genesis Biomed, the facility where Emily had worked. There were photos of labs, equipment, filing cabinets, and then, at the bottom of the stack, there was a photo that made David's blood run cold. It was a photo of a wall covered in missing person posters. Not just Emily's face, but dozens of others. Women, all of them in their 20s and 30s, all of them reported missing within the past 5 years. All of them had worked at Genesis Biomed at some point in their lives. Agent Hayes spoke quietly. "Mr. Miller, Genesis Biomed has been under federal investigation for the past 18 months. We've suspected them of conducting unauthorized medical experiments, illegal genetic research, and potential human trafficking. But we haven't had enough evidence to move forward. Until now." David stared at the photos, his hands shaking. Agent Kwan spoke next. "The woman we have in custody claims she was held in a facility. She described medical procedures, injections, memory exercises. She said there were others there, women like her. She doesn't remember much, but what she does remember matches reports we've received from other survivors." David looked up. "Other survivors?" Agent Hayes nodded. 3 women have come forward in the past year, all of them claiming to have been held at a secret facility connected to Genesis Biomed. Their stories are consistent. They were taken, held, experimented on, and then released with fragmented memories. But none of them were pregnant. This woman is the first. David felt sick. He asked the question he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. What were they experimenting on? Agent Hayes took a breath. We believe they were attempting to clone human embryos using genetic material from deceased individuals, and then implant those embryos into surrogate carriers. The room went silent. David couldn't speak. He couldn't move. The words hung in the air like something out of a nightmare. Agent Hayes continued. We ran a DNA test on the fetus the woman is carrying. The results came back yesterday. She paused as if giving David time to prepare himself. The baby's DNA is a 99.8% match to Emily Miller. Mr. Miller, the child that woman is carrying is genetically your wife's. David stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He stumbled toward the wall, his hand pressed against his chest, trying to breathe. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Emily was dead. Emily couldn't have a child, but the FBI was telling him that somehow, impossibly, a child with Emily's DNA was growing inside a stranger's body. Agent Kwan stood and moved toward him, his voice calm. We know this is overwhelming, but we need your help. We need you to talk to her again. We need to understand what happened at that facility. David turned, his voice hoarse. Who is she? If she's not Emily, then who is she? Agent Hayes answered. We're still working on that, but we think she's one of the missing women, and we think Genesis Biomed used her as a surrogate without her knowledge or consent. David returned to the secure medical facility where the woman was being held. She was sitting on a bed in a small room, her hands resting on her belly, staring out the window. When she saw him, her face lit up, and she stood, moving toward him. But David held up his hand, stopping her. He needed answers. He needed the truth. He asked her directly, "What's your real name?" The woman's expression crumbled. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. I don't know, she whispered. I don't remember. I only remember being Emily. I only remember you. David felt his heart break all over again. He asked her what she remembered about the place she'd been held. She closed her eyes, trying to pull the fragments together. She described a cold room with metal tables. She described people in white coats who spoke to her in soft voices, who told her she was helping with something important. She remembered needles. She remembered being shown pictures of a man and a woman, being asked to memorize their faces, their names, their stories. She remembered being told over and over, "You are Emily Miller. You love David. You are going home." David sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Agent Hayes, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. We believe they conditioned her. They implanted memories, fragments of Emily's life, using a combination of psychological conditioning and possibly experimental drugs. They made her believe she was Emily. The woman looked at Agent Hayes, then back at David. But I am Emily, she said, her voice desperate. I remember our life. I remember everything. Agent Hayes shook her head gently. You remember what they told you to remember? The woman started to cry, deep, wrenching sobs. David wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how. Because the woman he was looking at wasn't his wife, but she was carrying his wife's child. Over the next 2 weeks, the FBI intensified their investigation into Genesis Biomed. They obtained warrants and raided the facility in the middle of the night. What they found inside was beyond anything they'd anticipated. In the basement of the building, hidden behind a locked door that required biometric access, they discovered a series of rooms that looked like something out of a science fiction film. There were cryogenic chambers lining the walls, each one containing biological samples, embryos, genetic material harvested from individuals without consent. There were medical records detailing procedures that had never been approved by any ethics board. And there were files, Dozens of them, each one labeled with a woman's name. One of those files was labeled Subject 17, Lydia Harper. Agent Hayes opened the file and found a photo clipped to the inside cover. It was the pregnant woman. Her real name was Lydia Harper. She was 29 years old, originally from a small town in Kentucky. She had volunteered at Genesis Biomed 3 years ago as part of a paid medical trial. She had signed a consent form, but the form had been vague, misleading. She'd thought she was participating in a fertility study. She had no idea what they were really doing. According to the file, Lydia had been selected as a surrogate candidate. She'd been implanted with an embryo created using genetic material extracted from Emily Miller's preserved tissue samples that Genesis Biomed had obtained shortly before Emily's disappearance. The embryo had been cloned using a controversial and illegal technique, one that had been banned in the United States years ago. But Genesis Biomed had continued the research in secret, funded by private investors who believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough in human genetics. Lydia had been conditioned over the course of several months to believe she was Emily Miller. She'd been shown videos of Emily and David's life together. She'd been given transcripts of their conversations. She'd been taught to mimic Emily's mannerisms, her speech patterns, even her handwriting. The goal, according to internal memos found in the facility, was to create a functional psychological integration so that the surrogate would bond with the child and ensure a successful pregnancy. But something had gone wrong. Lydia had escaped. The file didn't explain how, only that she'd been reported missing from the facility 2 weeks before she showed up at David Miller's door. The FBI arrested the lead scientist at Genesis Biomed, a man named Dr. Peter Caldwell, along with 6 other staff members. During interrogation, Dr. Caldwell admitted to everything. He claimed he'd been trying to help grieving families to give them a second chance. He said he believed what he was doing was ethical, that he was offering hope where there was none. But Agent Hayes didn't see it that way. She saw it as exploitation, as manipulation, as a complete violation of human rights. Dr. Caldwell was charged with multiple federal crimes, including illegal human experimentation, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Genesis Biomed was shut down permanently, and the facility was seized as evidence. But the question remained. What would happen to Lydia Harper and the baby she was carrying? Lydia was placed in protective custody while the FBI continued to untangle the legal and ethical mess. David visited her often. He didn't know what else to do. She wasn't Emily, but she believed she was. And the child she carried, the child who was genetically Emily's, was the closest thing to his wife that still existed in this world. Lydia's conditioning began to fade slowly as she received therapy and counseling. She started to remember fragments of her real life, her real name, her real family. But those memories were clouded, distant, as if they belonged to someone else. She told David one afternoon, her voice quiet, "I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I'm 2 people at once." David didn't have an answer for her. He could only sit with her and hold her hand and try to offer some small measure of comfort. 3 months later, Lydia went into labor. The delivery was complicated and David waited in the hospital, pacing the hallway, his heart pounding. After 8 hours, a nurse came out and told him the baby had been born, a healthy girl. But Lydia had lost too much blood. They'd done everything they could, but she didn't make it. David stood in that hospital hallway, numb, staring at the nurse as she explained what had happened. Another woman gone. Another life lost. But this time there was something left behind. The nurse asked him if he wanted to see the baby. David nodded, unable to speak. They led him to the nursery, and through the glass, he saw her. A tiny, perfect little girl with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that hadn't yet opened. The nurse handed him a clipboard and explained that since Lydia had no living relatives, and David's DNA was a partial match due to the genetic connection to Emily, he could apply for custody if he wanted. David looked down at the baby. She was innocent. She hadn't asked to be born this way. She hadn't asked to be part of an experiment, but she was here. And in a strange, impossible way, she was Emily's daughter. David signed the papers. He named her Hope. The case was sealed under national security confidentiality. The FBI released a brief statement saying that Genesis Biomed had been shut down due to illegal activities, but they provided no details. The media speculated for weeks, but no official confirmation was ever given. David took Hope home and raised her as his own. He moved to a different town, started over, built a quiet life away from the reporters and the questions. Hope grew up healthy and curious, with dark eyes that reminded David of Emily every single day. He never told her the full story. How could he? How do you explain to a child that her mother wasn't really her mother, that she was the result of an experiment, that her very existence had been a crime? But he loved her. God, he loved her more than anything in the world. Because she was a miracle. A strange, impossible, heartbreaking miracle. And every time he looked at her, he saw a piece of Emily, a piece of the woman he'd loved, living on in a way he never thought possible. Years later, when Hope was old enough to ask questions, David told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. He told her that her mother had been an extraordinary woman named Emily, and that she had loved him more than anything. He told her that Hope carried that love inside her, in her very DNA, and that made her special. Hope listened quietly, and when he was finished, she hugged him and said, "I'm glad I'm here, Dad." David held her tight and whispered, "Me too." But late at night, when Hope was asleep and the house was quiet, David would sit alone and think about everything that had happened. He'd think about Lydia Harper, a woman who'd been used and manipulated and ultimately gave her life for a child that wasn't even supposed to exist. He'd think about Emily, the real Emily, and wonder if somewhere, somehow, she would have approved of what he'd done. And he'd think about the men and women who had created this nightmare, who had played God without understanding the consequences. The case had been closed, but the questions remained. Was Hope truly Emily's daughter, or was she something else entirely, a genetic copy without a soul? Was Lydia a victim or a vessel, and did it even matter in the end? And what did it mean for humanity if science could bring back the dead, not as themselves but as echoes, as fragments, as memories implanted into someone else's mind? David didn't have the answers. He wasn't sure anyone did. All he knew was that he had a daughter now, a little girl who laughed and played and looked at him with eyes that held the past and the future all at once. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. If a stranger showed up at your door claiming to be someone you lost, would you believe them? Or would you call the FBI? Tell us what you think happened that night. Subscribe for more real-life mysteries that defy belief.